CPD cycle was, don't include planning under implementation, don't include implementation under evaluation. That also sometimes takes up characters. But if you just have the pertinent information there, you should be absolutely fine with the characters. If you find that you're running out of characters, you need to ask yourself, what am I saying that isn't relevant? So just read it and think, how can I say this? We want it concisely. Okay. All right, so we've spoken quite a lot about evidence. I've talked about making sure that, 75% of the BSs are behavioral statements are covered. Now, the way to deal with this, it is incorrect, and you just, you're setting yourself up to get your CPD entry returned as not yet competent. If you simply provide evidence and say, this is my evidence for CS 1.1. You need to provide evidence for individual behavioral statements. Guys, this is probably the most important statement on this presentation. You should not provide blanket evidence for a complete CS. The evidence must be there per behavioral statement. And that's why we're saying start working with the behavioral statements under in your planning. In fact, as early as your reflection, think in terms of the behavioral statements in your planning. In the implementation, put it there, and you provide evidence per behavioral statement. So this in the block here, consider each behavioral statement as a standalone activity. Okay, and that is how you work towards getting a successful CPD entry. And as I mentioned this already, err on the side of caution. If it says you need 3 out of 4 and you've got enough evidence, then put evidence for 4. If it should be, 4 out of 6, it's okay to add evidence for 5 of the behavioral statements out of the 6 or whatever the math is. So that if one piece of evidence is rejected, you'll still be okay. But this is it, guys. Consider each behavioral statement as a standalone activity. Okay. When we come to particularly that there's the one on dispensing. And I mean, dispensing is your bread and butter there, 3.4. If you read those behavioral statements for 3.4, they actually are very, very different activities. The same with your 5.3, your mandatory one. The activities, the issues covered in your different behavioral statements are different. So please, this is the most important thing. Okay. Let's move on. Oh, we still, I think this is the last one on evidence. I think we've mentioned all of this. Make sure it's all linked to a BS. And, when you just be careful with your labeling of your evidence, that when it's ABC, and if you've got in brackets in your implementation text an A, what A is it? If it's a behavioral statement A, then put 3.2A, because interns put A there and we don't know, are you referring to a behavioral statement or have you labeled your evidence as A? A tip that I'd like to give you here, label your evidence. If you want to use ABC to label your evidence, use capital ABCs. And then the small letter ABCs refer to your behavioral statements. And if you keep that in mind, evidence about the capital A, is referring to a piece of evidence. You've got A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But if you're referring to A, B, C as the small letters, that is written. And so if you also want to put the competency standard number in front of the A, then we're quite sure that when you are talking about an evidence label or when you are talking about a behavioral statement. So, those are really the things to look out for. Okay, I think we've talked about in insufficient and inadequate annotation. All right, let's move on. Oh, we're still on evidence. You can see from the number of slides on evidence, this is really the most important. If you go back to the February presentation, we talked about the criteria for evidence. Remember, to be annotated, valid, sufficient, current, authentic, okay, and the other one. So remember, we went through all those criteria, and every piece of evidence needs to meet all of those criteria. The most important is validity. And because we found in our experience as assessors and moderators, we found that very often interns upload evidence which isn't valid. We've decided here to draw attention to this error of invalid evidence. So what is invalid evidence? How do you make sure that your evidence is valid? It must be relevant to the competency standard. If your competency standard is about, I don't know, let's say it's about pharmacist-initiated therapy. Let's say it's a PIT one that you're doing. I can't remember the number of PIT. Then if you are providing evidence of a prescription that you were presented with, then that can't possibly be valid, because by definition, PIT does not refer to items on a prescription. So right away, that evidence that refers to a prescription will be invalid. So make sure it's relevant to the competency standard. It must be accurate. If you have evidence which includes calculations, if you make a mistake in your calculations, that's going to be considered as invalid. And also make sure that your evidence is presented in a logical sequence. All right, it makes sense that you should talk about evidence for that part and then the next. So think about, what do I upload first? What comes next? Make sure it's logical. And let's say it must also be correct. Let's come back to an example of a PIT one. If you talk about, you spoke and you assessed the patients, the symptoms that they told you about, and you decided that this was the condition, and you decided that you were going to supply them with a particular medication. If it's patently the wrong medication for that condition that you think the patient has, well, that's factually incorrect. And there's no ways that as evidence. Yes, it's evidence that you provided treatment, but if it's not factually correct, or if you say things about a medication that's not factually correct, then that evidence is not valid. And you know what all of this is saying? Is that you cannot rush these CPD entries. There are so many things that you need to be thinking about and checking and making sure that it's correct. You can't do these quickly. Okay, it takes probably 3 or 4 times longer than what you thought an entry. But it's so worth it at the end that if you spend that time and you pay attention to these issues, then you have, you know that you've done everything you're supposed to do, and you know that your entry is going to be judged as being competent. Then some of the physical issues around evidence are, guys, we know that you use your phones, you take photographs of evidence, but please look at how the light falls on the paper. Check the image that you're uploading. If it's just all shiny, we can't read it. Or if it's uploaded upside down, it's not professional, or if it's not arranged in a logical manner. Please just check these things. And then also another thing with evidence, make sure that if you are busy with CS 5.3, that the evidence that you're uploading there actually pertains to 5.3 and it's not for 6.2. We see that often, and that happens when you're working on 2 CPDs at the same time. And that's what you will be doing. You'll be working on more than one. Just check that you've uploaded your evidence against the correct. Because the assessor is not going to say, oh, you know what? I can see the evidence. They just put it in the wrong place, and I'm going to give credit. Sorry, guys, that's not going to happen. All right. So again, something else for you to check. Okay. So you'll see we've talked about evidence, which should ring all the bells. Aha, this stuff is really important. Okay, let's move on. We've come to the last phase of the CPD cycle, and that is evaluation. The most common error here, I could sum it up and saying evaluation incomplete. It's very clear on the page. There are 4 things that you need to include in your evaluation, and all of it needs to be there. It's on the page. You don't even have to remember it. It's written there next to the block there where you put in you type in your evaluation. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, what have I learned? 2, how has it impacted your process? I was able to blah, blah, blah. 3, the one most commonly left out. How have I applied this new competency? What does this mean? Let's look at it. You need to be able to give a specific example, guys. Specific example. You can't just say, I was able to counsel another patient. That's not applying your new competency. You'd say, so you need to give an example of something that you did utilizing this new skill which you've talked about in a different situation, not the one that you talked about under implementation. Implementation is done now. You've described it. You've provided the evidence to prove that what you've written there actually happened. Now you've moved on. You say, I've learned this. I've got this new skill. And here's another example of how I was subsequently able to use that skill. It must be a specific example. So give some detail. You don't need to upload evidence, but give us some detail. Let's say in your implementation, you were doing a PIT one, and it was for a patient who came in describing symptoms of stomach cramps and blah, 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 and you did the whole thing. In here, you would be able to say, I had another patient 2 days later who came in and was also asking me to provide some treatment because she had quite a bad headache or whatever. So the skill, can you see there, the skill of doing pharmacist-initiated therapy is the same, but you're telling us how you were able to apply the skill to another scenario. Okay. This is the one that is left out most often. And then I think by this stage, everybody's just tired and they forget to say, what are my future learning needs? I still need to learn. And that just reminds us that CPD is a cycle. And when you get to the end, we need to go to the beginning again. So guys, there's a big 3 red letters there, the little word called all, and you will only get fully met for your evaluation if you cover all of these issues. Okay, and that brings us to the end of some of these specific things pertaining to the actual phases. We've got 1 or 2 more generic issues which we're going to go into now. Next slide, please. All right, writing style. Oh, I would love you all to sit there and just sort of say, I am a professional. My CPDs that I provide, the manner in which I provide them, what I put on the screen, what the assessors and moderators can see, it must project me as a professional person. And if you write in a sloppy manner, if you do not proofread, if you use SMS language, if you say, I need to use SMS language, sorry, That's not professional. But if you say, I don't have enough characters, we don't have enough characters, you're including stuff which is irrelevant. So rather go back and say, what am I putting in here that I don't need to put in? Why am I running out of characters? You should be able to do it in the number of characters. Inappropriate language use. Guys, this is you showing pride in being a professional, improving it. This is how I am developing as a professional. And your writing style is absolutely part of it. Okay, we've talked about text. It's just not professional to, if you haven't even bothered to check that you've put the information on the right place. Tutors, we ask you, please, your validation. We know when your intern submits, it comes to you. You need to sign off of it before it's released onto the system. Please, tutors, just cast your eye over it and interact with your interns and say to them, really, guys, there's so many spelling mistakes here. Just fix it up before I'm going to sign off of it. Look, as I said, you guys, interns and tutors, you're walking this journey together, and, use that opportunity, interact with your interns, and just cast your eyes, see if you can give them some help and just some guidance if you think that their writing style is not professional. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, not that common, but extremely important. If you breach patient confidentiality, it doesn't matter how excellent everything else is in your submission. Automatically, it will be not yet competent. I would say 99% of the interns are very good about obscuring patient details on a prescription. You're very good at that, and quite good at obscuring on labels, but you forget sometimes that there are other places where patient details or patient identifiers. If you put a photograph of a patient, even if a patient gives you permission, please obscure that patient's face, okay? Because that's a way of identifying a patient. And so even if they give you permission, it is better just obscure it. Look at signatures. Schedule 6 registers, probably the most common instance of where patient details, where the interns, where you forget that you are identifying details. Okay, so remember, everywhere where the patients can be identified. And then many of you, you take a box and, a box and you put it over the patient details, and that's a great way to do it. But something else just to check, technical issue here. Sometimes when you take your evidence and you convert it to a PDF, sometimes those boxes move. So before you press submit and you send it off for validation to your tutor, just look at your document again and make sure when you convert it to a PDF that those text boxes that you or those boxes or whatever you've put over the patient details, if they haven't shifted. Okay. And sometimes you will get, you say, but I obscured the patient details, and yet your entry comes back not yet competent, and there's a message from your assessor saying breach patient confidentiality. Sometimes could just be that the text box moved when you converted it to a PDF. Okay. People, this is a really serious breach. We cannot stress enough. And I always say, think how you would feel if there's a prescription of yours, if one of your health issues is made available in the public domain. How would you feel? Okay. And when you think about how you would feel if somebody's reading that you received a prescription for an STI, you're not going to be happy about that. And I think if you think about how you would feel, then it would make you more vigilant about not breaching the confidentiality of any of patients. And just to remind you again, confidentiality only pertains to patients, not to any healthcare providers or healthcare facilities. Anything that is done within the course of their professional activities, you don't obscure doctors' names, nurses' names, only the recipients of the healthcare service. Okay. I think there's one more under these sort of general issues. Next slide, please. The dreaded resubmissions. Yeah. We saw from the poll that many of you here tonight are dealing with the resubmissions. Now, I know what happens. You get your CPD entry back. The assessor says, not yet competent. And you say, you know what? I'm going to take my chances. I'm going to resubmit this entry in exactly the same. The next person, maybe I'll get lucky, and the next person will be a little bit more lenient. Sorry, you are fooling yourself. Your entry is going to go back to the same assessor, and the assessor is going to see what comments they put on it. And it's quite amazing how we see this. And the assessor, the second time around, the assessor says, you haven't paid attention to any of my comments. And that's bad. What's really bad is when we see a second resubmission and the assessor says, you still have paid no attention to my comments. So tutors, tutors, could we ask you, please, before you validate an entry, a resubmission entry, just say to your intern, have you looked? Have you paid attention? Have you corrected? Have you paid attention? Have you looked at what the assessors have said? So please, tutors, can we ask you just to sort of prod them and say, or are you simply trying to resubmit this without making any changes? Because if that happens, if it goes through, it's simply going to come back again and you're going to have to resubmit again. And you will soon then run out of free resubmissions, and then it's going to start costing you. Because you allowed X number of free resubmissions, and then you have to start paying. So never ignore the assessor comments. And the assessors, by and large, give you very, very useful feedback, and it's there to guide you as to how the resubmission. Pay attention to what the assessor says. They might tell you that you can't salvage this entry. And that's particularly the case if you have chosen an incorrect CS. You can't fix it. You have to do something else. Or it might just be that the assessor is guiding you and saying, look, what you've done is okay, but it's incomplete, and this is what needs to be attended to before you resubmit. So make quite sure in your mind, what is the assessor guiding me? Are they saying this one is beyond redemption? Try something else. Or are they saying, can it be amended? And certainly, if the assessor picked up on something the first time around, they're not going to miss it the second time around. And if you haven't attended to it, they're not going to say, oh, I'm sure the interns have paid attention. They will see, they will check, and they will simply put not yet competent again. This is really an important issue. And tutors, you can really help this process along by just saying, before I press the submit button for your entry, have you attended to the assessor comments? Okay, let's move on. Right, still on resubmissions. Because I talked about professionalism a little bit earlier. Don't try and fake this lot. If you have provided an entry and you were compounding something, and there was no batch manufacturing record, or there was no expiry date, or you were talking about a domain one, you did some public health, a health promotion campaign, and your assessor said, it's insufficient evidence because there's no evidence from the recipients, there's no attendance, there's no, feedback from your audience. Now it's let's say it was May when you're there. Let's say you were describing a public health campaign that you did in April. You submit the CPD. Assessor says it's insufficient because there's no feedback from the audience. You cannot create feedback from that public audience. The assessors are really smart. And if you didn't have an attendance register, don't create one because it will not be accepted. Okay? Please don't falsify. Don't create any evidence. If there was no feedback from a specific audience that you had 2 months previously, you can't just now suddenly fabricate an evidence. You can't fabricate. If you were doing a patient counseling one or a pharmacist-initiated therapy and there was no patient history taken, you can't suddenly, for a scenario that happened 2 months, suddenly fabricate the patient history and give a whole dialogue and say, the patient said this. Guys, please, the assessors are a lot smarter than that. And it doesn't talk very well in terms of your professionalism. Okay. So this resubmission, it's very, very important. And unless you pay attention, you take it seriously, you will get it coming back to you again. So be very clear about what is required when your entry requires resubmission. It might be something simple like a text box that moved and there's patient details. It might be something as simple as that. Okay? It might be something which you can actually fix where, let us say, your evidence was not annotated in accordance with, the evidence wasn't linked to the behavioral statement, then you would probably be able to fix that entry. Or you might not be able to. If right at the beginning the assessor says, you've chosen the incorrect CS, you can't fix that one. You have to start again. Okay, let's move on. All right. Natalie, could we have the feedback from the third poll, please? Where we asked you for some feedback on which CSs you found particularly problematic.
Okay, Prof. It looks like CS 5.3.
Okay, we do address 5.3. Okay.
4.2. 3.4.
4.2 financial management. I'm not sure if we have a specific one on that. Okay.
3.4, and then the whole of CS4.
3.4 is definitely in the presentation. 5.3 is definitely there. 4.2, I'm not sure. Sorry, which was the other one?
CS4.
It's 4 is the whole domain.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay. All right. So as I say, we do address 3.4 and 5.3. Thanks, Natalie. Okay, so now we move on to the next part of the presentation. We've now dealt with those generic errors which apply across all 6 CSs that you choose. We're now going to look at, and again, the ones that we've chosen to include in this presentation stem from the combined experiences of the assessors and the moderators, where they looked at the intern, the work submitted so far, and which were the most problematic ones. Okay. Are you giving me the presentation back, please? Adele, can I just ask, are there any other questions at this stage before we go on to the specifics? Anything pertaining to those generic ones?
No, Prof. We had two more comments about the 1,000 characters. That's not enough for implementation.
Mm-hmm.
And the one intern asked, how would they go about, just a clearer example of how they would go about labeling that. And while I was thinking about this, an example might be, say you evaluated a prescription. Then you can say, I evaluated my prescription and your label. And then in your evidence, you can state, this is my evidence for behavioral statement 5.3a, where I applied the Medicines Act. I used Regulation 33. Here it is. Here's the prescription that I evaluated. So the annotation provides the rest of the story in the evidence, but the main idea, I evaluated my prescription, that's in the implementation phase. And it's a short sentence, actually. And then you can provide more detail in the evidence of how you did
which
that.
resource you used, why you used it, how you used it against your prescription.
Yeah, because we see a lot of times an intern would state, I evaluated my prescription by using the Medicines and Related Substances Act, and that's not really necessary. You can provide the evidence for that, and you can just label all of those pieces of evidence and say, I evaluated the prescription, but in the evidence, you provide the regulation, you provide the prescription, and you properly annotate of how you did this. I hope that
assists. The behavioral statement.
Yeah. And Prof, we will get to the other ones. There's a few questions regarding 4.6 and a few for 6.2, but I will tell Prof when we get
6.2 is in the presentation. I think 4.6 as well.
And 4.6 as well, yes.
Okay. So it seems we're having the ones we've picked out and the ones that the interns have pointed out. So hopefully we're on the right track here. Okay, guys, the second part, now we're looking at specifics. We're not going to cover all the competency standards. Again, very, very important, do not start with a CS entry unless you have read the entire competency standards. In other words, make sure that you have read all the behavioral statements. It's very easy to read the title of a competency standard. Let's say you read 3.4, medicine dispensing. Oh, yay, I dispense all day. This is going to be a great CS to choose. I'm going to choose CS 3.4, and off you go. When you stop and read all the behavioral statements under 3.4, you'll see that there are a lot of different activities that are included there under medicine dispensing. So you cannot and you should never start with a CS entry until you've read it. And when you're reading all of it, why are you reading? You're saying, will I be able to do this? Will I be able to cover? Are all of these behavioral statements within my scope here? Will I be able to provide evidence for sufficient of these? That is why you must read the complete CS entry first. Don't forget something that was in the earlier workshop. We rated each of the CSs and we said whether they were recommended or whether they were possible, whether they were challenging. If we label something as challenging, it means avoid it. Okay, there was a reason why we labeled it as challenging, because in our experience, it was extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, for interns to be able to provide sufficient evidence to cover enough PSs. Okay, so the challenge, go to those, there are those tables, they're all in the and check which ones. In fact, you should have marked next to all of your CSs, whether it's a recommended, a possible, or a challenging. All right. Possible, stick to the recommended ones. Those are the CSs that every intern, irrespective of their practice setting, should be able to do. The ones which are possible, We labeled those as possible because not all interns are busy in the same practice settings. Not all interns are exposed to the same possibilities. And here and there are interns that are able, they're exposed to a few more non-traditional areas. And for them, they might be possible. But those CSs which are labeled as possible are not intended for everybody. So do yourselves a favor and try and choose CSs that are labeled as recommended. And if you choose one that is labeled as a possible, make sure that you're making an informed decision. Sorry, could we just go back to that previous slide? There was still something at the bottom and I can't remember, see what it was, please. Okay. Consider, as I said, you must choose the recommended ones. Choose a possible one, only if you're really sure about what you're doing. Avoid the challenging one, and then look at the separate behavioral statements and ask yourself that. Okay, let's move on now. Domain 1. Next slide. Domain 1. Domain 1 is labeled as public health, and so we thought that it is worth our while to spend a minute talking about what do we mean by public health. Okay. Public health, we're talking about an activity which benefits a larger community audience. Public health is not about your one-on-one interactions with a patient. That is not public health. Yes, of course, your patient is part of the public, but that is not what is implied by public health. So if you choose a 1.1 or a 1.6 and you talk about how you explain something to a patient, that is not public health. That is not taking something which is going to target or benefit a larger community audience. And when we're talking about public health, remember also to think about what do you understand by health promotion? What do you understand by primary health care? These are integral parts that fall under the activities which are deemed as public health. Another concept which is incorporated under Domain 1 is this concept of a health campaign. And when the CS requires you to provide evidence that you were engaged in a health campaign, it is not a health campaign unless you've done all of these things. You need to identify the health need. You need to prepare an intervention. You need to deliver the intervention. It is not enough to say, I read up about COVID safety precautions. That's not a health campaign. It's not about you learning about the health issue. It's about you knowing about a health issue, but the important part is delivering it. Okay? You must provide evidence to who was your target audience. How did you choose them? Why did you choose them? And how did you deliver this information to them? And then that's not enough. You can't just deliver information. You can't just say, oh, I put a poster up there and I put some pamphlets on the countertop. That is not a health campaign, because you not only do you need to deliver the message, the health message, but you also need to ascertain whether they paid attention to it, whether the message was received, and whether they understood the message, and whether the message would be likely to move that audience to take action. So you can't just produce a poster or produce a pamphlet or produce a presentation and then just willy-nilly find a group of people, stick them in a room and talk to them. It must be a target audience. What do we mean by a target audience? An audience for whom that health promotion message is relevant. Okay? So it's not just a question of taking a health message and delivering it to, well, whatever Okay, come sit here quickly. I need for this CPD, I need to talk to people. That doesn't work, guys. You have to explain who was your audience, what was their makeup, why was that audience the correct target for the specific health message that is involved in your health campaign. So when you look at this whole domain one, these are the underlying concepts which you really need to pay attention to. Okay, and this is not about one-on-one talking patient information. Then you must go to domain 2, where it's safe and rational use of medicine, where you're talking, one-on-one to individual patients. Okay, so please pay attention to these. Read your manuals. Read, each of the domains has an introductory paragraph there. Read those again, because it explains very clearly what each domain is about. Okay, let's look at specific. I think I've got something on the next slide. Let's move on. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, 1.1, very popular. It is labeled as a recommended, and it's a great CS for you to choose. And every intern should be able to do this well. I've talked about this in the general things. You can't have individual things. And, yes, your colleagues are handy, but they don't make up a target audience for the health message. And you can't just have a randomly. This is what I talked about on the previous slide. Okay. We need you to show, many of you for this 1.1, you give great detail about how you source the information about the health message, and you might even have your resources there, even the details and in your planning. And then you stop. You don't provide evidence of how you delivered this message to your audience. And when you talk about how you developed your materials, you've got to link it to the health need. What is the health message that you're trying to promote? Okay. And show us, explain how the materials that you use to carry across this health message, how was it relevant to that health message? And then, remember to make sure that you've included all those aspects of a health campaign. So please don't tell us you made a poster and you put it up on the wall. Don't tell us you made a pamphlet and you put this pile of pamphlets on the counter. That is not interacting with a target audience. And interaction, remember, it's a two-way street. What did you give to the audience? And we must have some evidence of how the audience received that message. Okay. So don't forget that with this interaction, you need this two-way. How did your audience interact? And again, on resubmission, you can't create these feedback sheets. Okay, if it was something that you did months before, you can't suddenly create them. Okay, that was 1.1. And these are some general things that also pertain across things like 1.6 as well. Okay, next slide, please. 1.3. 1.3, which is professional and health advocacy. By and large, we find that behavioral statement A is ignored. And let me read what behavioral statement A is. It's, I know why you choose 1.3. It looks great. It's only got 2 behavioral statements. Okay. And yet one is often ignored. So behavioral statement A says, participating as a pharmacist within a healthcare team. Very, very few of the interns actually talk about that, describe it, and provide evidence for how you participated within a healthcare team. Most of the interns go straight to behavioral statement B. Unfortunately, it's very often misinterpreted. So behavioral statement B says, applying health policy and procedures in practice. So it's about applying health policies. Policies, we're talking about wider health policies. Don't forget that this 1.3 is within the domain of public health. You can't take an SOP which is pertinent to this practice setting in which we're talking about bigger health policies. And always remember that these policies must be public health oriented. So a big one, only 2 behavioral statements, and yet one is ignored. And this one, you use in-house policies. We don't want, in-house policies don't work here. There's another place later where you can go to in-house policies in domain 4, but certainly not here in domain 1 where you're talking about public health issues. Okay. All right, let's move on. Okay, we haven't looked specifically at the other issues. Let's move on to domain 2, safe and rational use of medicines and medicine. Patient counseling. Patient counseling. If you look at the competency standard for patient counseling, those behavioral statements go up to A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. That's 9. And they are, so unless you pay attention to the behavioral statement, unless you remember that each behavioral statement needs to be considered as a standalone activity, your implementation, your evidence is going to be insufficient. What have we found? Which are the behavioral statements that are most often simply ignored? A is very often, most times ignored, which says, established existing understanding and knowledge of health conditions. You've got to first explain, how did you find out where is the patient at now? You can't simply jump in and say, I counseled the patient in this particular way. You first got to understand, where's the patient at? And in order to give the evidence that, you've got to say, what did the patient say? You've got to have evidence of the patient's feedback. You can't simply say, I counseled the patient without some evidence to prove that you actually counseled the patient. So this is what goes wrong in most of the CS 2.2 entries, that there isn't evidence to support the story that you're telling under implementation. A very good idea is take notes during your counseling session. Provide that as a piece of evidence. This is what I wrote down when the patient was talking and explaining what their problem was, and you made little notes. That's a nice piece of evidence that you can include and annotate and say how that meets the needs of behavioral statement A, which is about establishing the patient's understanding and what their actual process is. Now, very often we find with this 2.2 and patient counseling that the whole entry is focused on the content. Okay, let's say you were counseling a patient about side effects of medicine, which is what one does to ensure the safe and rational use of medicine. And and you provide all the evidence about, what the contraindications are and what are the counseling points and blah, blah, blah. And it's all about the content. But many of you forget to talk about how did you actually counsel? How did you communicate? What language, what decisions did you use about the type of language? How were you sensitive to the patient's cultural background? All of those things are covered there. You can't only talk about the content of the counseling session. Remember, it's about the generic skill of developing the skill of patient counseling. You can't only focus on the content. So read the behavioral statements. Tell us how you communicated. Okay. So focus on the interaction with the patient, the actual counseling, and not only on the content. And then remember, if you upload a photo of you and a patient, even if you obscure the patient's face, so that shows you can take a photo. If it's not annotated, it's not telling the story. Okay? Remember that each piece of evidence must be annotated to tell the story. And don't forget to make sure that you've included sufficient. So the patient counseling is also, it's a good example of where it's really obvious that many interns don't read the behavioral statements. They simply read the competency. Patient counseling, I can do this. Yes, of course you can do it. But you can't do it in sufficient detail. I can't really show enough about the skills development and let you pay attention to all the behavioral statements. Okay, let's move on. Pharmacist-initiated therapy. Again, we still see this where the whole entry is around a medicine that's on a prescription. Well, that just is silly because the definition of pharmacist-initiated therapy implies that. Okay, you can't do PIT without taking a patient history, and yet we read so many of these CPDs where there's absolutely no evidence. You can't simply say, well, I took a patient history. Well, hello? Tell us what you asked. What exactly were the questions? And more than that, what were the patient's answers? A history? It's a two-way thing there. You ask, they answer. You take the answers, you evaluate the answers, and you decide what the problem is. Once you've decided what the problem is, you can make a plan, and then you can provide treatment. But the treatment that you provide doesn't make any sense, or it's not justified, unless you provide the patient history. And again, this is something which you can put in as evidence. In your implementation story, you say, I took a complete patient history, evidence labeled A. And under A, you can write, these are the questions I asked, these were the answers. So there's another way again, where you don't have to put all the detail in the implementation story. You can provide that as a piece of evidence. And also, then tell us, so what did you do with this patient? PIT is all about, I listened, I asked, I listened, I evaluated. You need to tell us, how did you decide? Why did you decide on a particular choice of treatment? Okay, you have to put it all out there. And PIT is initiated by a patient request. And if you don't actually tell us what the patient asked for, so you should start off your PIT entry by saying, I encountered this patient who asks me what they should use for blah, 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 blah. Okay, make sure the patient request is actually there. Okay, so all of this, and as I said, you can easily put these in your evidence, what you asked, so the complete history. And then in your discussion, how did you evaluate? Why? Don't you say, I recommended to them that they use Loceral 5% to once a week on their toenails. Why did you come to that? What was it? What were the questions you asked? What made you decide that they had a fungal infection of the toenails? What made you decide to use Loceral 5% nail lacquer? Okay. All right. Let's move on to domain 3. Are you seeing, guys, even though we are looking at specific competency standards here, there's still a commonality that flows through, and that commonality is paying attention to individual behavioral statements. Okay, so that is a running through all of these. 3.4 was one that you identified in your poll. And yes, there's a very good reason. I'm glad that you identified it as a problematic one. It's extraordinarily problematic. And most of, let me not be through. Let's say many of the entries look only at behavioral statement A. And behavioral statement A for competency standard 3.4 is that nice, easy one. Behavioral statement A, evaluating, interpreting, and preparing the prescription in line with legislative requirements and informing patients of availability of generic medicines. And that is where many, many interns stop. They read the CS, medicine dispensing, okay, I can do this. And they only look at behavioral statement A. And sometimes they don't even do behavioral statement A completely. So again, guys, when you are checking whether your prescription is valid, make sure you're using the latest reference. Okay. Outdated reference would be automatically considered that your evidence is not valid and your entry will be sent back to you. Make sure you've got the correct reg. Outdated. Read those. There's a separate one here. Performing pharmaceutical calculations, documenting and recording interventions, applying GPP principles, preparing extemporaneous preparations. 3.4 is a very, very intensive competency standards because medicine dispensing is our bread and butter. It is much more than simply evaluating a prescription and picking a medicine, sticking a label on it and saying to the patient, take 1 3 times a day. Okay, there's a lot more involved in the dispensing process. Just a couple of things, guys. Please, if you're taking powder, an antibiotic powder for reconstitution, putting 72 ml of distilled water in a bottle and shaking it, that's not compounding. It's part of dispensing. It's simply not compounding. And if your dose is 1 TDS for a week, and you say, I had to calculate this 7 days in the week, 7 times 3 is 21, so I had to dispense 21. Please, guys, that is not a pharmaceutical calculation. That is simply part of dispensing a prescription. So don't attempt it unless you have examples of proper extemporaneous compounding and pharmaceutical calculations. And this is one where it's extremely important to consider those behavioral statements as standalone activities. So you correctly identified 3.4 as a problem. So have we. And I hope that you take all of this advice to heart. And if you're doing 3.4, those of you who haven't done 3.4 yet, just pay attention. You need to cover at least 7 behavioral statements. So it's a challenging one, but it's the medicine dispensing. That is what pharmacists do. So it's a great one to do. It's highly recommended, but make sure you cover sufficient behavioral statements to meet the 75%. Okay, let's move on, please. Medicine compounding. About equal numbers that choose 3.4 or 3.5. And we know what the thinking is. Well, if I look at 3.4, the behavioral statements go right up to A. 3.5 is a doddle. There's only one behavioral statement. So it must be easier. That's not true, guys. Yes, there's only one behavioral statement, but there is so much which is implied in that one behavioral statement. And let me read that behavioral statement to you again. 3.5 medicine compounding. One behavioral statement. A, applying pharmaceutical knowledge to the formulation and compounding of medicine. Apply pharmaceutical knowledge. Do you know how many 3.5 CPDs we read where there isn't one word which talks to anything which is related to applying pharmaceutical knowledge? So it's about compounding. So applying pharmaceutical knowledge. Why do you compound in the way? Why do you use why do you use a mortar and pestle? Why do you weigh it out like that? Why do you use a container which is like doesn't allow lighting? Why do you label like that? Why do you mix like this? Why do you allocate? All of those things apply. Why do you grind down your powder before you incorporate it? Tell us what you did, but why? And refer to your pharmaceutical knowledge. You spent 3 years at least studying pharmaceutics. Show us that you know your pharmaceutics, please. And that is where people go wrong with 3.5. Oh, it's the easy one. I just have to compound something. But we need to see that you know, that you explain how you've applied your pharmaceutical things. Expiry dates. Big issue, the expiry dates. You must tell us what did you, and here we're actually being nice to you. We're telling you which regulation from Act 101 for your expiry date. Show us the excerpt from Act 101. Show us how you calculated the expiry date for your compounded product. And yes, we are aware that in some of the institutions, they do use longer expiry dates. If you work in one of those institutions and that is the practice there, it's okay. But you need to be able to say, you know, according to this regulations, it's actually incorrect, but there's a reason why it's done, blah, blah. We need you to show that you know how expiry dates are calculated. And we need those expiry dates. We need those batch manufacturing records. We need your calculations. Show your calculation. And please make sure your calculations are correct. So on the surface, 3.5 looks like a doddle. It's one of the few CSs with only one behavioral statement. But those 3 words, they apply pharmaceutical knowledge. Okay, that. So please do not attend 3.5 unless you are prepared to show how you apply your pharmaceutical knowledge. Your references, your resources that we use, we expect you to pull out some sort of pharmaceutics reference as well. Okay, you've got plenty of them. You've studied enough pharmaceutics. Okay, don't forget about these issues around the expiry dates. Okay, let's move on. Domain 4, I believe from the poll that you identify domain 4 as a difficult one, and particularly domain 4.2. We haven't got 4.2 specifically, but let's talk about 4.4, 4.6, and about this domain. Let's look at the comment at the bottom here. Domain 4 is an example of one of those domains where you should carefully read all the behavioral statements for the competence before you decide which one of the CSs are going to. Because there are quite a few of these domain 4 CSs where if you look at the individual behavioral statements, you're going to say, I'm not going to be able to do that. Go back to the earlier presentation, look at how we label them, and see which ones we recommended and which ones we said are going to be too challenging. And there are some that you're not able to do. If you are choosing a domain which implies something about an SOP, please don't choose an SOP and say, well, this is an SOP about XYZ, but we don't actually do XYZ in this pharmacy, so I wasn't able to apply this SOP. Well, why did you choose that SOP in the first place? It's not a way to get out of showing how you applied an SOP. So think very carefully about what it is. So let's just look at 4.4 versus 4.6. They often are confused, and these are the ones where if you choose the incorrect one, your assessor may well say, you've chosen what you're writing here. Let's say you've chosen 4.6. They might say, no, this belongs under 4.4. Then before you resubmit, you need to take that. You need to change your entry to a 4.4. You need to fit it under a 4.4 or the other way around. So 4.4 deals with quality assurance. 4.6 deals with policy development. What does that mean? If you look at the behavioral statements, and look, I'm going to agree with you. I don't think domain 4 is the most logical and the clearest. It requires you to read quite carefully. It is not as clear as domains 1, 2, and 3. You need a little bit to look at what is actually embedded in these competency standards. Domain 4.4, quality assurance, it talks about how you participated in updating an SOP and getting it approved. How you participated, not here's an SOP which I use, which I apply. It's very, very specific. It talks about updating an SOP. So you need to show, and you need to show what you did. Quite difficult. Make sure that you are involved in that before you choose a 4.4. Read it. It talks about how you ensured quality assurance was, and it talks about details of document management. And frankly, if you looked at that, this is possibly enough to say, let's not choose 4.4. Quite difficult, doable, but not as easy as some of the other domains. So please look at them, interpret these behavioral statements. 4.4, it only has 3 behavioral statements, so you have to cover all 3 of them. So if you just leave one out, you automatically don't have enough. 4.6, on the other hand, it seems to be similar, and it is similar in that it's in the same domain, and we learn these organization and management skills. And 4.6 talks about policy development. And if you read the behavioral statements, it's about applying an SOP, and you see that little and that's sticking in there? Also about applying a policy. There are only 2 behavioral statements, which means it's an and. Behavioral statement A, apply an SOP. Behavioral statement B, apply a policy. And so what you need to show, you need to do both. And don't forget the you here. No, it happened. How did you apply? How did you apply a policy? So domain 4 in general is challenging. You have to think very carefully, get the right evidence. But you can't do an SOP or a policy because you will simply get an assessor message saying, insufficient evidence, you haven't covered enough, you haven't covered both behavioral statements. Okay, don't choose an SOP that you're not able to do. And remember that SOPs and policies are not the same. And this is a lovely one to, have a chat with you. Chat with your tutors. They're there with you. They're there to guide you. So, I'm ready now. Domain 4 is my next one here. But, I talked about policies. Am I right here? Do you agree with me? I see this is an SOP and this is in policy. This is what should be happening. This to and froing with your tutors. Okay, so we got a question, Adele?
Yes, we have 3 interns that had questions regarding 4.6. The one said, how would I go about to apply a policy relating to evidence? The other one said, for domain 4.6, could an example be given on what type of SOP to apply and what type of policy to apply? Mm-hmm. And the other intern asked more or less the same.
Okay,
so yes, it's 3 of them. Yes, I think the first place to start for the SOPs, or maybe the first is to find out what the difference is between a policy and a SOP, just to get that distinction. And then go to the GPP. There's a long list, depending on the facility that you are working in, which SOPs need to be there according to legislation. And then you can really select any SOP that is applicable to you. It ranges from temperature control, receiving of stock, compounding. The list is endless. So just go to your tutor, ask them for your SOP file, because that has to be in the pharmacy as well, and then go through the SOP file and see which one is most appropriate for you. Depending on how the SOP is structured, a SOP usually flows from a policy. So you can find a policy there as well, depending on your pharmacy. But you can also think a little bit broader regarding the national drug policy. So there are a number of them, but first I will start with the GPP and find policies and SOPs in the GPP and talk to your tutor and see which ones are in your pharmacy that you will be able to apply.
I hope there isn't an intern out there that doesn't know that there's a file of SOPs, that every pharmacy must have a file of SOPs. I hope you're very familiar with that file. If you're not, that's your job for tomorrow, to find that file of SOPs. Okay, so you had a very clear answer there. So start off, make sure you can differentiate between an SOP and a policy, and make sure you provide evidence of how you applied it. And without realizing it, you're applying SOPs all the time in your day-to-day practice. You're doing temperature control. That's applying an SOP. There are so many. How you receive stock, there's so many. But if you're doing an SOP on receiving stock as your SOP, you can't, and if you've done that for under domain 2, you can't do it the same thing again. Okay, so don't repeat something that you've done. So where is it, supply chain management or something? If you've used evidence before, don't use that particular SOP. The list, there are so many SOPs. It's not difficult to find a unique one to use for this SOP. So yes, we acknowledge domain 4 is hard, but just sit down, think about it, and then it will be doable.
Prof, if I can maybe just add, if you then decide on a SOP, then take that SOP. And if the SOP state, for example, there should be a basin specifically for compounding, take a picture of the basin and annotate that to the first point in your SOP. The next step says, for example, you must have adequate space, or you must have all the equipment. Then show the assessor all the equipment. So what you will do then is you will take the SOP and you will show us how you applied each step with evidence and annotations.
Okay. All right, guys, I wish you well with domain 4. It's a little bit not as comfortable as patient counseling or PIT or receiving stock or even public health, but this is also a really important part of your practice as a pharmacist. And that brings us to our favorite 5.3 on the next slide. Ethical and legal practice. And even if you look at 5.3, ethical and legal, do you know how few interns even write the word ethical in their whole entry? So that gets, and I don't know what's happened, but somehow the word has gotten out there that for 5.3, we must talk about dispensing Schedule 6 prescriptions. Yeah, that's fine. But simply talking about dispensing a Schedule 6 is not going to give you enough for the requirements of CS 5.3. It's part of it. It's okay. It's appropriate if you do it properly, but it is certainly not enough. There is no ways that if you talk about dispensing a Schedule 6 prescription, that you will be able to meet sufficient of the behavioral statements. There are 5 behavioral statements, so you have to cover at least 4. And there's no ways that dispensing a Schedule 6 can do enough. This is about your ethical and your legal practice. Let's just stick to legal. If you're practicing legally, you are being guided by the latest legislation. Show us that you know what the latest legislation is. Show us how legislation has been most recently updated. Provide that in your evidence. Explain that you know this is the legislation, this legislation, that legislation, that legislation that we need. And provide evidence. The one behavioral statement which is ignored a lot is the professional indemnity requirements. You cannot tell us that you're providing evidence that you are going to apply for professional indemnity. Because if you do not have a professional indemnity, You're not practicing ethically and legally. You are required to have current professional indemnity. Do not do this until you have proof that you have professional indemnity. It's as easy as that. Showing us that you're going to apply or your application or something, that is not providing proof that you have professional indemnity. Okay? Explain why you need it. Explain what you is. Talk about it. If you simply ignore it or you don't have professional indemnity, you cannot do 5.3. Okay, behavioral statement E. Practicing and adhering to the obligation of a pharmacist in terms of the principles of the statutory code of conduct. They were talking about the ethical things. I've seen very, very few 5.3 entries which even talk about code of conduct. And here again, it's so important that you look at these behavioral statements as standalone and that you provide evidence per behavioral statements and not just blanket evidence for the competency standard. If you do that, you will be absolutely fine. Okay, but you cannot ignore this indemnity. You must have evidence of your indemnity cover. Okay, and the ethical practice. Okay, I hope that clarifies the problems and why so many of your 5.3 entries are returned as not yet competent. And we come to our final domain, domain 6.
Sorry, Prof. Regarding the indemnity insurance, we do have an intern that states that the indemnity insurance has lapsed and they have applied to PSSA, but they won't have any feedback when they have to submit by Friday, the 10th. They ask if they can submit the application or that they are trying to contact PSSA. I do think if you look at the behavioral statements, there are 5 of them. So if they address the other 4 sufficiently, then they can just
include the code of conduct. Yeah.
Yes, they include the code of conduct, and they maybe just speak to indemnity that they have applied. Then they will be successful, because if there are 5, you need to address 4 of them. So
and
you can
also provide evidence that they have had indemnity insurance, and this is not a question that they've never had and they're only applying now. Because I think applying for renewal is different from applying for the first time.
Yeah. So without that, it is possible to be successful in 5.3, but you must just make sure that you address all the other behavioral statements sufficiently. And then we have another question, 5.3, on keeping abreast of legislation and applying relevant amendments. Can you clarify more on this? So I think, first of all, you have to show your assessor that you know where to find new legislation. So you can go to Pharmacy Council's website, you can look at legislation, you can look at board notices, you can look at government gazettes, you can find everything. So show your assessor you know where to find new legislation. Show us if there's something that you didn't know. You used to find a practice number on a prescription, and now we are looking for the registration number. If that's something you did not know, you can tell us this is something new for you and now you have applied it. If you haven't applied it yet, you can just say there are no new legislation, but I do know where to find it. And again, there are 5 behavioral statements, so if you're not able to do this one, make sure that you supply sufficient information for the other 4.
Okay, that's a nice, clear explanation, interns. And if you really take to heart what you've been told now, you should be able to manage 5.3 with no problems whatsoever. Okay, domain 6. This was addressed in February, the difference between 6.2 and 6.3. And again, this is where we find that very often the entry is, you've chosen a 6.3, and it's sent back to you, and your assessor will say this is more appropriate for a 6.2. So in a nutshell, once again, let us clarify the difference between 6.2 and 6.3. But before we do that, This domain is about education. It's about teaching and training, okay? So when you are doing any of the domain 6, yes, you need to use a specific topic to talk about how you provided education. But the skills development that you need to focus on is about education. It's not about learning about a topic. So again, make sure you know the difference between the content or the subject matter and the actual skills. Okay, so this is about education. Yes, if you're going to train somebody about how to do blah, 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 yes, you've got to talk about the content. But from that, you must extract, I learned while training them about that topic. I learned how to train. I learned that this is what you do and this is what you don't. And I'm able to now take that skill of training and I was able to apply it in another situation. Okay. So remember that domain 6. Yes, you can't talk about developing a skill of training or education without referring to a topic, but it's not about the topic, it's about the skills development. 6.2 is if you are training some in your workplace, your colleagues or pharmacist assistants. If you're doing that in the workplace, 6.2 is going to be the one to choose. But if you choose 6.2, please, once again, read the behavioral statements. There are only 3. So you have to cover all 3. You must talk about an agreed teaching plan. So how did you, obviously your tutor is going to be the person that you're going to talk with and agree what is the topic you're going to cover and how you're going to cover it. And there must be evidence for that. It talks about guidance from an experienced colleague. Tell us, provide evidence of who that was and how they guided you. How you develop teaching and learning materials. Teaching materials, you know, it's about content. Learning materials could have been what materials are you going to have to assess them? And I think we've now lost our... I'm not sure. I think we've lost our presentation.
Prof, can you see?
No, I can't. I've got a blank screen. I know we've just come to the end of our time.
Adele, are you able to see the presentation?
Natalie, yes, I see the way forward screen.
Okay, so I'll just talk quickly to 6.2, 6.3, and I think I know. I think maybe Adele, if you can see the way forward screen, you can take that one. Is that okay?
Yes, Prof, that's fine.
Okay, so just 6.2. If you are training within your workplace, then you choose 6.2 and make sure all those issues are covered. 6.3 is very specific. 6.3 is about participating in formal education of students. And students are pharmacy students. So only if you're involved in teaching pharmacy students would you take 6.3. And if you're doing 6.3, you must provide evidence of what is the subject matter. And this is obviously, you know, much easier for academic interns, but many of you are exposed to students that come into the pharmacy and you could be involved in teaching, but then you must talk with them and you must provide evidence of the module. These pharmacy students don't just come to you and do the work that they're doing. Their workplace learning is usually attached to a module. You need to provide evidence and to show us how your interaction, how your teaching of these students, even if it happens in your workplace, how it is attached to a specific module at their university. Okay, so choose carefully whether 6.2 or 6.3 is the appropriate. And thanks. Adele's going to now finish off the presentation, the last few slides. Thanks, Adele.
Thank you, Prof. Okay, so we're now at the way forward for you guys. So I think the most important things for you to get from this presentation is please read the entire competency standard and all the behavioral statements before you decide to select a specific competency standard. It's very important to use the behavioral statements to guide the whole process. So your behavioral statements should guide your reflection, should guide your planning, it should guide your implementation, and because that is what you have to provide evidence for ultimately. So use the behavioral statements to guide you in your process. Then please consult this presentation and the one in February. You have now cross-links between the two presentations. And very important, as Prof said, please pay attention. If you receive any feedback, please pay attention to that. If you do not understand the feedback that you received from your assessor, ask your tutor to assist you. And if you really do not know, please contact counsel so that they can get you in contact with your assessor. You can do that on the page where you go to contact us, submit a request, and then you select the CPD tab. So if you really struggle and you really do not understand the feedback from the assessor, because you have to address that to be successful, please contact counsel so that they can get you in touch with your assessor. Okay, Natalie, the last slide, please. So the last slide is more a way forward for the tutors. And we please ask you to stay involved with your intern. And intern, if you don't get a lot of time with your tutor, go and make arrangement for a meeting so that they can encourage you and help you to meet your deadlines. And important for you, please let your tutor know when you plan to submit so that they can verify. And please ask your tutor to look at your entry, to really evaluate your entry next with the checklist to make sure that you have entered all the phases correctly, your evidence is valid, it's professional, and that all the comments have been addressed. So this is where your tutor can really assist you, but all of these you can also make sure before you submit, and then your tutor can just be the last checkpoint before you submit to your assessor. Okay, so next we have all the questions. Natalie, I don't know if I should maybe just go through the questions and those we haven't answered, we go now through all of them, or would you like to read the questions, or should I just go on?
Adele, I think you know which ones you've answered and haven't, so it's best if you carry on.
Okay.
Thanks.
The first one is, good evening, my CPD 5.3 was marked unsuccessful and then I resubmitted it after editing it according to comments in the report. However, it was marked unsuccessful again. I was wondering how I can go about getting into contact with the person that assessed my CPD. I would appreciate it if I can get some guidance. So as I said, important to contact counsel. I think it's important that you have to speak to your assessor. You go onto Pharmacy Council's website. In the right-hand corner at the top, you'll see that little phone icon. If you press on that, there's send a request or submit a request. I can't remember the exact wording. There you put in your P number, and the query will then be CPD. It then goes through to the correct department, and you can type what the problem is. And they will then send that message through to your assessor and ask your assessor to contact you via email or telephone number, whatever you selected. So go onto the website and submit your query, log it, and then council will ask your assessor to contact you. Okay, the next one. I was also wondering if you could provide us some advice with regards to how to add all the details mentioned during the session while staying in the 1,000 characters. I see there was still a number of the 1,000 characters is not enough. Trust me, the 1,000 characters is more than sufficient. If you really struggle and you don't know how to get all the information into that block, I'm sure you can ask counsel for assistance. There's a lot of us assessors that would be willing to assist you just to get it more concise and to get it to fit into the into that 1,000 characters, but it's more than enough space if you structure your implementation description well. So if you really struggle, please contact counsel. I will even assist you if you ask counsel. And there's a lot of us that will assist you. So please feel free so that we can just help you to structure your CPD correctly so that you will be able to fit it into that 1,000 characters. That's also about the 1,000 characters. That one we also about the 1,000. Then we have one, I would like to know exactly what is meant with a self-assessment in 6.2. If you go and look at 6.2, as Prof. Butler said, it's always important not to focus on the topic, what the education is about, but also on the bigger picture, providing education. So if we do a self-assessment, you can add, if you did a self-assessment on the topic, because a lot of pharmacies, the tutor allocated training to you as an intern, and you are not familiar with the topic. So you can do a self-assessment on the topic, but you will also have to do a self-assessment on your ability to provide education and training. So you can do it twofold. So assess yourself in your education skills. Are you able to do a proper presentation? What should be in there? So you can do both. Do one on the topic and do one on your skill to provide education and training. I don't know if Prof would like or Zelna would like to add anything to that, but I think that would be sufficient.
Yeah, I'm happy with that.
I also think you've covered it nicely.
Okay,
but again, it's just remembering that there's the content, the topic, but the broader, the more important picture is the skill that you're developing related to the domain.
Okay. Thank you. The next one is with regards to domain 6.2a, what teaching guide could one use? If I look at A, I think the intern refers to the teaching plan. The teaching plan, usually you will make or will design your own teaching plan. It will state when it will be, where it will be, what it will consist of. Will it be a presentation? Will you have a quiz? Will you have an assessment? It's how you are going to structure this training, the plan for the training. So you will, because there was another comment, do we have to create a training plan? Yes, you do. You have to create your own training plan for your specific training session. And then you will say, I will do a pre-quiz, I will do training with a PowerPoint presentation, I will have an online quiz, or whatever you decide to do. There will be a tea break. So the whole plan, the program for your planning, that will form part of your training plan. So just how you will do the training. Then I would like to know exactly. Yes.
Sorry, just before you carry on, I have published the link for the attendance register and survey. If all interns and all tutors can please complete the link.
Okay, so everybody please just log on. Then we have a question, I think anybody from council, or I can answer as well. If I'm successful in 3 CPDs up to date, when is the last possible date to submit the outstanding 3 CPDs to meet the requirements to write in August? Can we submit them just before booking for the exam or before we write? Tabang, you can maybe just correct me if I'm wrong, but if you are registered in your 6th month, you have to submit 6 CPDs, be successful in 3 to book for the exam. But Tabang, if you can maybe just confirm.
Okay, thank you, Adele. Yeah, that is true. Those who are in their 6th month, they should have submitted at least 6 and be successful in 3. And those who are in their 9th month or more, they should submit all the 6 CPD entries and be successful in all of them. And we will be having the last release of results by on the 4th of July. That will be the last date on which we will be releasing the CPD results before the coming pre-registration exams. So those who still need to be successful in 3 entries or more, they must just make sure that they submit by the 10th of this month, which is Friday, so that their CPDs can be part of those that the result will be released on the 4th of July. Thank you.
Thank you, Tabang. The next question asks, is it acceptable to have one document which covers multiple behavioral statements and you to annotate them on the document and explain how they were achieved? Yes, that is acceptable. What we see a lot of interns do is they just provide a poster and then they say, this is evidence for A, B, C, D, and E. That is not acceptable. But if you properly annotate the document and show why this one document is applicable to, say, A and D, then that is acceptable. But just make sure that you don't blanket annotate and put all the behavioral statements in a document that it's not applicable. But that will be acceptable because one document can be evidence for more than one behavioral statement, but make sure that you cover that behavioral statement sufficiently if you use one document. Then there's a comment, I think it was one of the students that commented on the 1,000 characters or interns. They said, but when I do the implementation and the evidence that way, more detail in the evidence than the implementation, the comment in the report says that I did not describe the behavioral statement enough in the implementation. However, I thoroughly described it in the evidence when I resubmitted it. In this case, I would suggest that you ask counsel to connect you with your assessor. Maybe they would like something else to be added, or they feel that the behavioral statement is not addressed sufficiently. It's difficult to comment on this one, why the assessor will tell you that. But I think in this case where you have resubmitted it and you feel that you have thoroughly provided the information, I think it would be best for you to contact counsel because it's difficult to say why the assessor made that decision. Next one, what does it mean when the CPD status says submitted for compliance? Tabang, you can just then maybe just clarify if it means that you are successful.
Okay, maybe just to add on that, Adele, submitted for compliance, it has 2 meanings. When your CPD has been assessed and moderated and it's awaiting release, the status will be submitted for compliance. And once the results are released, if you are successful, the status will remain the same. But if you are not, the status will change to awaiting submission. So it's always important when you're seeing the status to be submitted for compliance to open the entry just to check whether you are successful or is still awaiting to be released, because sometimes interns, they just see submitted for compliance and they conclude that they are successful. That is not always the case. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Tabang. Always something new to learn. Okay, another comment. Good evening. As an intern, I find that my role in most settings is observational as I'm still learning from senior colleagues. I participate in CPD events and ward rounds by listening to the presentations. However, I am not always able to contribute by saying something or presenting as I myself am still learning. How can I show that I participated in this case? Can I add my crypt notes as evidence? Will that be acceptable? This is a difficult question to answer because we don't know for which competency standard or for which behavioral statement you want to use this. It's important to remember that you have to show us that you are able to do something. So depending on what the behavioral statement was that you wanted to achieve with this, the answer will probably be no if you didn't do it. Because I don't know, there's no behavioral statement that that asks on shadowing, but it's difficult. I don't know, Prof. If we don't know what behavioural
I'm
statement.
just thinking of those ones, if where it talks about P&T committees and things like that, and if you're not participating, then I think it's saying, look at another CS.
Yeah, so
It's
if we can
sounding
maybe.
like if you can't get evidence and if you're not participating, you need to look somewhere else within the domain, perhaps.
Yeah, I would agree. It's difficult if we don't know what behavioural statement you want to address with this, but I would suggest that you maybe look at something else in this case, because there are some behavioural statements and domains that you will be able to do where you can actually show us that you have done this. The next question, Prof. Butler, I have a question. You said that your colleagues cannot be used as your audience. So for instance, your colleagues are your target audience.
Okay, yes, I did say that. But I also said that you must be able to explain on the basis of what is the health promotion message? What is the behavior that you'd like to change? How does that relate to your audience? And let's say you want to do something on, I don't know, on diabetes or something like that. Unless your audience is a group of diabetics, your colleagues then would not be a target audience. You must be able to explain why that was a target audience for that specific message. And, in the early days of COVID, I suppose, and look, we've all over COVID and doing COVID training, and I don't think that's happening anymore. In the early days, and certainly in 2020, we did see situations for Domain 6 where colleagues were a target audience for the application of COVID prevention measures. But generally, if it's a disease related or a wellness or a lifestyle issue, then your colleagues are not going to be. Because health promotion, it's not about simply imparting information. Remember that health campaign there? It must be information that would be able to move your target audience to changing their behaviors. So just using your colleagues, you're just improving their knowledge, but that doesn't fulfill the criteria of a health campaign, because just improving the knowledge of your colleagues, it's not talking about their behaviors relating to the health issue. So I think that's why look at that slide that we talks about what is health, health promotion and the health campaigns versus public health. And if it's truly that you have a health promotion message which is intended for your colleagues as the target audience, where that health promotion means irrelevant to them, if something like that happens, then fine. But it's really going to be a very unusual situation where that is the case. So look at the content of the message and ask yourself, does this pertain to being able to change the behaviors, not just the knowledge, but the behaviors of them as an audience? I hope that helps.
Thank you, Prof. The next question, does the policy have to be related to the SOP for 4.6? And no, they don't have to be related. You can select one policy and another SOP, so they don't have to be related to one another. The next question, how do you prove that you performed a self-assessment? That depends on how you did your self-assessment. Just show us how you did it. Did you do a quiz? Did you do it in collaboration with your tutor and they can maybe verify? So just show us how you did it. The evidence to show us how you decided you need to learn this, how you assessed yourself. That can depend. I've seen checklists, I've seen quizzes, I've seen short courses. So there's a lot of things that you can do to show your self-assessment. Ask your tutor to assist you. Maybe they can also provide some guidance there. Next question, good evening. Is it permissible to change the CS to another one within the same domain if I find it difficult to get enough evidence for the first one? Yes, that is acceptable. Just go and edit. Once you get your submission back, just go and edit it and change everything to the new CS that you have selected, and make sure that you take away the old evidence. That's very important so that you don't leave not valid. So yes, it's permissible, but just change the whole entry. Then another one, how can we contact the moderator with regards to getting more information to ensure improved resubmission? As I said, you can contact council on the submit a request button, and they will get you in contact with your assessor, and they will be able to assist
come
you.
in there just to Intern,
Yes,
can you
Prof.
just clarify the different roles between an assessor and a moderator? The assessor looks at your performance. As a moderator, I look at the performance of this group of moderators. We look at the performance of the assessors. So it's not relevant to want to contact a moderator because we look at the performance of the assessors. The assessors look at your performance. So you should be trying to contact your assessor, not the moderator. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Then there's a comment or a question from Facebook. For domain 6.2, I got a comment that I must show how a more experienced colleague guided me. The colleague did write a letter of confirmation so that for the providers of training and education, where she did say we agreed on a training plan and she did approve the training plan beforehand. Not sure what else I can put in my evidence specifically for that. If I look at this, I assume that this submission came back, that it was not accepted by your assessor, because you see, I got a comment. If that was the only issue that your assessor had, I would again say contact council to get connected to your assessor so that they can maybe provide clarity regarding this one. Because if you have a letter for A and the pharmacist did verify that, there's maybe some other issue that was not clearly communicated to you. So I would suggest you to contact council. Another one from Facebook. Am I correct in saying the GPP is considered as a policy that the pharmacy uses? Yes, there are policy statements in the GPP, and the GPP also gives us some guidance regarding policies that should be available. So you would be able to use sections of the GPP for this submission. Prof, do you have something there to add to this intern as well?
No, I agree with you on your answer there.
Okay, then another one from Facebook. What is the difference between a policy and an SOP? I do think you can maybe consult the literature regarding a policy and an SOP. A policy statement is a broader statement. A SOP is a lot more specific with specific steps that you have to follow. But there is some guidance in the literature with what the difference is. And you will see, as I say, the policy is broad and the SOP has specific guided steps that you have to show us how you followed the steps.
I mean, think for example, you know your SOPs are very specific to a task and it's stepwise. But if you think of, you automatically will offer your patient a generic. Why are you doing that? Have you thought about that? Every time you offer your patient a generic, you're applying a policy. What policy? Have you thought about the NDP? Okay, so you see that what you're doing, by doing that, you are applying it. So just show us that you know which policy it is and where it talks about the issues around generic substitution, for example. Okay. So policies are much broader, and SOP would be a step-by-step. This is what you do when you need to apply climate control or insect control or whatever. But think of the National Drug Policy. You are actually applying a lot of the issues from the national drug policy without possibly even realizing it.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Then there's a comment, if the assessor comments are excellent submission, but only gives a 2 out of 3 for the section, is that not regarded as being unfairly marked? How could this be addressed? If you fail a CPD and you have excellent comments, I would definitely contact counsel to get in contact with your assessor. But maybe the assessor felt it is a very good submission, but 1 or 2 things were not specific enough, but they didn't mention that. That might be one reason. Or there might have been some additions that would have would have given you the 3 out of 3. But if you were not successful with excellent comments, I would really address that. But if you were successful and you are still successful, I don't know. Maybe Prof can add to this, but I think if you are successful and you got a 2 out of 3, then there's maybe just some small thing that the assessor would have liked to see, but they still thought you deserve to be successful in the CPD. If you are not successful with excellent comments, then you should contact your assessor.
Yeah, if they say excellent and you're not successful, then I think something needs investigation there. But successful and 2 out of 3, which is still very, very good, that I think is acceptable. That just means, what you did was very good, but maybe just needed one more step. But it wasn't enough to say that you're not successful. But an excellent comment with a not yet successful doesn't sound right to me. I'd ask your assessor for some clarity on that one.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Prof. Then is there a limitation to the number of CPDs that one can submit? I assume that you want to submit all 6 or 4 or 5 at once. No, there's no limitation. You can submit all 6 your CPDs at once or 1 at a time, or however you would like to submit them. We do suggest that you don't submit all 6 at once unless you have to submit now to write exam, because you have to get some feedback from your assessor. Maybe you are making a small mistake that you don't realize, and to get feedback before you submit all of them, but you are free to submit any CPD at any time. Then is it mandatory to resubmit within a month of getting the results? Can we resubmit whenever we are ready? After a few months, you can resubmit whenever you are ready, whenever you have successfully fixed your CPD or you changed your evidence. You can submit whenever you want to. Another comment for domain 6.2, is it about research on something that you discovered? Please elaborate. 6.2 is not about research. 6.2 is about provision of education and training. Research you can find in 6.6. So I'm not sure if I'm not understanding the comment correctly. So 6.2, you provide education and training, and that can be to your colleagues in the pharmacy. 6.6 is then the research one. So if the intern, if I'm not answering the question, the intern might just maybe post again. Then regarding the requirement...
Maybe just if we say on 6.6, if you're going to choose to do 6.6, remember you must provide evidence for every step in the research process. You can't just provide a research proposal. You must have your proposal, you must have your ethical evidence of your ethical approval, have your results. So the whole research process you need there, not only a research proposal. And again, probably quite difficult for many of the interns to do, and quite easy for the academic interns to do.
Yes, thank you, Prof. Then we have a question again regarding the CPD requirement to write exam. Regarding the requirement of having 6 CPDs submitted and 3 competent that was mentioned, please could you elaborate? If we are already competent in 3, can the outstanding 3 be submitted at any time before booking, even if the last 3 are not marked? Example, if it's submitted after 10 June deadline, and we are just submitting at the time of booking for the exam. we would have 6 CPDs and 3 competent, but not all 6 marked. Would this still meet the requirement to write the exam in August? Tabang, I don't know if you would like to take this one.
Okay, thank you, Adele. Thanks for the question. You know, the requirement is silent. I think that's where the confusion is coming, because it doesn't say you should have submitted all 6 and have been assessed on all of them. So because it's not clear, we will say you should have submitted all 6, even if it's not yet assessed. And then, yeah, as long as you will be successful in 3. And then you have submitted 6, even if it's not yet marked, because that is the submission. That is what it says, the requirement. That's why I'm saying maybe next year we will make it even more clearer. But for now, it's talking about submission only. Thank you.
Thank you, Tabang. Then we have another one. I was told by my tutor that domain 6.2 is about identifying a problem and finding a solution for the problem by doing research. How true is this statement? I think we have addressed this one. If you go and look at your intern manual, you can see that 6.2 is providing education and training. So there you will have to develop your skill of providing information to colleagues, and 6.6 is doing research. So maybe ask some clarification from your tutor, but research fits into 6.6 and education and training fits into 6.2. Then I just started my internship in April. Do I also have to submit all 4 CPDs this Friday, or will give us another time? Just consult your intern manual. The submission dates is available in the manual. And if you only registered in April, you have sufficient time to submit before the next exam. So you can find the submission deadlines or due dates in your manual. Then we have a comment from one from YouTube. Prof, what you're talking about, is it based on domain 1 only? Because we usually do a presentation and audience are our colleagues.
When the presentation there, before we looked at specifics of 1.1 and 1.3, we said, think about the fact that domain 1 is about public health. And that is what you need to bear in mind. Domain 1 is about public health. If you're doing presentations for your colleagues, you are possibly looking at 6.2 at the training. Perhaps you can do some more there and turn that into a 6.2. Think about that. But generally, that doesn't sound as if it's enough for a domain 1, because it's public health. Okay, but think about, if you're doing some training for your colleagues, and if you've got some some ability to get some feedback from them and some material development and some plan on how you're going to provide this information, you may well be able to build that up into a 6.2.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Then there's a question, am I allowed to work on my CPDs at work, specifically filling in the cycle steps through the SAPC portal, editing my evidence and updating my evidence entries and submitting? I do think that you should discuss this with your tutor. I would expect you to be able to do your CPD at work, because you have to discuss the process with your tutor, gather your evidence, get all the required information in the pharmacy. So it will be difficult not to do some of the things in the pharmacy. I do think you can capture the steps maybe after hours, But I do think this is something that you have to discuss with your tutor, and what the time available in the pharmacy permits you to do, and what they can accommodate you, because you have to get the evidence and get everything ready. But I do think the editing and the final submission can be done after hours. But if you discuss it with your tutor and they can spare you and they have time available, then it can be done in work hours. But I do think it's pharmacy specific, and you have to discuss this with your pharmacy, with your tutor or your RP. Then another one, can a tutor be held accountable for neglecting to verify my CPD submissions and the submission date passes? Tabang, I don't know if you would like to answer this one for us, maybe.
Okay, Megan, may you please assist on this one? And or Mr. Morano.
Sorry, if you can just repeat the question.
Hi. The intern asks, can my tutor be held accountable for neglecting to verify my CPD submissions and the submission date passes?
Yeah, the tutor would be responsible for the overall supervision or tutoring of an intern. It also would depend on when the intern submitted their entry. If you submit an entry to the tutor 2 days before the submission deadline, obviously it might be that the tutor is busy or inundated with work and they're not able to attend to your CPD query. But it is also incumbent on the intern to follow up with the tutor and not leave it until it's too late. We urge interns to submit their entries on time to afford the tutors enough time to verify their submissions before they are submitted on time. But please do follow up with the intern. But if you, with the tutor. But if you experience any challenges, you can also escalate the matter to counsel. But ensure that you do escalate that matter before the submission deadline passes, so that we can assist you maybe to communicate with your tutor should you struggle to get through to your tutor. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Then I think there's another one for council, please. Good evening, I'm a tutor. Since Monday, I've been having a challenge with my SAPC account. I cannot access the CPD tab to review the CPDs of my intern. I've tried reaching council since Monday with no success. If you can provide a contact for quicker response, thank you.
Okay, maybe Adele, maybe if the tutor can just share his or her PIN number, then I will contact her tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. So can the tutor please just share their PIN number with Tabang so that she will be able to contact you and assist you in this regard. The next question, good day, Ms. Nadia. If one is already competent in 3 CPDs, I think we have addressed this, and you have written the practice exam, will you be allowed to sit for the August exam if the other CPDs are submitted by the 15th of July? As we've stated, you have to submit 6, you have to be successful in 3, and the other 3 should be submitted before booking. So I'm sure that answers that question.
Maybe let me add on to that one, Adele. We don't encourage we don't encourage interns to wait until the last day, because remember, from the office we need to draw a report on who is meeting the requirement to sit for the exam, who is not. So if you wait for the last minute, you might find that the system is refusing you to book, because would have instructed the system to say these are the people who should book and things like that. So just to make sure that you don't get surprised on the last minute, you better make sure that you submit on time. If the exam is on the 6th or the 6th and the 7th of August, if I'm not mistaken, at least by the 30th, you should have tried to have submitted, so that you allow the office an opportunity as well to take care of other logistics. Thank you.
Yeah, yes, Tabang, and that's true. And with load shedding and IT problems and network, and it's never a good idea to wait until the last minute to submit. So as soon as your CPD is completed, submit. Don't wait for deadlines. Don't wait for due dates. Just submit, because we all know the evening you want to submit, there's a problem with your internet. So just submit them. Another question, what other evidence can you use for a counseling session 2.2 aside from the tutor statement and feedback form? Should we take pictures of the patient? You can take a picture, just remember patient confidentiality. You can show us a picture of how you used additional teaching aids. You can do that by using a picture. So there's lots of things you can do. And if you do decide to add pictures, just remember patient confidentiality. But the tutor statement is good. Feedback from the patient is good. But you can add pictures. Let me just see. I think we have one more question.
Oh, okay, Adele, I'm sorry, let me interrupt you. The booking for the exams is opened up to the 24th of June 2020. So meaning if somebody is going to wait and submit in July, they will be disadvantaging themselves, because by that time the closing date would have passed.
Okay.
So they must also take that into account. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks, Tabang. Then we have another question. It says domain 4.4 on behavioral statement A. Can I attend training on a SOP but not participate in the update? No, unfortunately not. You have to address the whole behavioral statement, and part of the behavioral statement is you have to participate in the updating of the SOP. So then if you cannot do that, I would suggest that you look at other competency standard, maybe 4.6, one of those, but you have to participate in the updating and the training to be successful in 4.4a. Then I have another comment. Sorry, I did not clearly hear the answer about can we change a competency standard if we do a resubmission? Yes, you can. If you've done 3.4 and you now want to do 3.5, you can edit that existing CPD. Just remember to remove all the old evidence, remove all the old information that you typed in, because if you leave something from the old CPD, the assessor will tell you it's not valid. So you can change, but just make sure that all the information is updated to the new competency standard that you have selected. Natalie, I think that is all of the questions.
Yes, thanks, Adele. Tabang, would you like to close us out?
Yes, thank you so much, Natalie. I just want to correct something. I'm sorry, the exams booking will be opening from the 4th of, from the 24th of June, and will be closing on the 8th of July 2022. So interns need to take that into consideration, meaning submitting later, it will disadvantage you from booking for the examinations. And with these few words, I just want to take this opportunity to thank the assessors and moderators who avail themselves to take the interns through, just to give them feedback with the aim of helping them to improve. We really appreciate it from the office. And thanks to the interns and tutors who also avail themselves so that they can be able to be taken through on those omissions. I believe they have gained a lot, and they will be able to get all their CPDs successful. We really appreciate you joining this session. And I also want to thank colleagues from the office for being there. It really means a lot, for the interns as well. And the team from communications, we thank you. You are always there for us, and we really appreciate what you're doing. And with those few words, I just want to thank you all. Oh, and before I close, we will make this presentation available on the website. We will upload it, I think, by tomorrow, and then you can always have it just to refer in case you need it. And thank you so much. Have a good evening. Bye.
Good luck, interns. Hope it goes well for the rest of the year. Bye.